Hello! Within this video, we would like to present you a new feature that comes with the Terraform Exporter for SAP BTP. As you probably know, the Terraform Exporter for SAP BTP is a convenience CLI that helps you with bringing existing infrastructure under the management of Terraform. Now, up to now, the main heavy lifting that the Terraform Exporter did was to get the import blocks and get the Terraform configuration for you and get them in a decent format. Now, you had to do several steps in order to get it really ready for usage, but at least those cumbersome steps of getting the import blocks and getting the keys up in place for the import is taken over by the exporter. But we got some feedback and this wasn't good enough for us. So we made some improvements. In order to show these improvements, I would like to start with how the import or Terraform Exporter was working before this improvement. As you might know, there are different flows how you can import resources via the exporter, and one is using a JSON file that contains the inventory that you want to import. And in this case, we are using a JSON file that contains a sub-account, several entitlements, an environment instance, a subscription, trust configurations, roles, role collections, as well as a service instance. If you have been using such a JSON file, the result of the import probably looked like this. So what you got is a lot of Terraform files, and as I said before, the heavy lifting around the import blocks is already done for you. Then you had a provider file. Now within this provider file we already see one shortcoming. The global account is hard-coded. This is something that you wouldn't do if you would have crafted your Terraform configuration manually, because then you would probably have used a variable. Same is true for the resources. So here we have a sub-account which belongs to parent. We see that there is a description that was not filled, so it's null. We see that there is a region, which is probably also something that we will put into variables. Now, while this is not super tricky to exchange, there are some other points where you really had to do some manual work. For example, bringing in the dependency to the sub-account resource for all the resources that depend on the sub-account via the sub-account ID that was hard-coded here. Now, this is true for all the resources that have been imported, and of course there are also different dependencies between the resources of, for example, entitlements and the subscription that we created or the service instance that we want to import. What we also see is, for example, here we have the import of a default trust configuration that we probably do not need because it's created automatically. And of course, we have some more complex dependencies between roles that get imported and role collections that depend on those roles. Now, we have not exported each and every role for the sake of the overview of this file. Now, while you could do all this stuff manually and bring the configuration in a shape and form that it works, we thought it would also be a good idea if we do that. And we started this with introducing a new experimental feature that you find in the documentation on the Terraform configuration improvements. Here, as you can see, there is a little parameter, an environment variable that you have to set to a non-empty value, and then you will switch on this experimental feature. And as the documentation shows, there are now several points that will happen once you have activated that, like extracting variables, like bringing in dependencies between the resources. And we have, well, different functionalities on different levels. We are just starting the journey, so I decided to showcase that one on a sub-account. And to keep things a bit more crisp, I already executed the export, which takes a few minutes, having this experimental feature activated. Now let's take a look at the code that was created. What we see at the first glance is we have now a variables file that got created if we compare that to the one before that wasn't there. So obviously some variables have been extracted, and as I said, global account or region or something like a parent ID are good candidates to be extracted from the Terraform configuration. So let's see if they also found their place in the configuration, starting with the provider TF. And as we can see here, we have the variable here for the global account, which makes the configuration much more flexible and feel much more like if you would have done it manually. Now, the bigger job has to be done in the resources. This is interesting to see that here we already got rid of this empty description attribute. And we also see that the variables have been replaced correspondingly. Now, let's check all the other things that we came across. Okay, so we have now a subaccount ID that references the resource that we have created within the configuration. That's good, because that's manual work that we don't have to do. And as we can see, that's happening all over the place. Now, another point that came to our attention was, for example, the BTP subaccount subscription that depends on an entitlement. So we would have to do a depends on block. And as we can see here with the experimental feature, we get the depends on block to the entitlement. So we have the feature flags dashboard with the plan name dashboard, and that's pointing to entitlement 4. Let's check if that's the case. Entitlement 4 is the feature flags dashboard with the plain name dashboard. So that was already configured correctly. That's cool. Now, when it comes to the trust configuration, we now just have the trust configuration that is not the standard one, not pointing to SAP default, but the custom one. And if we don't have the resource, we also shouldn't have the import block right. And also here, the import block has vanished. Let's compare this to the one before. And here we still have our SAP default. Let's continue. As we said, the role collections also depend on the roles. So let's see if there is something happening here. And again, we have here a depends on block for our subaccount viewer role collection, which says, hey, I depend on role 26. And this one is the subaccount viewer role. Looks good. A more complex introduction of dependencies is for service instances, because as you are aware, service instances have a plan ID attached to their resource. So we have a service plan ID, which could not be directly linked to an entitlement. So if you would craft the code manually, what you would do is you would have the entitlement, you would have a data source that reads the technical ID of the service plan, depending on the entitlement, and then you would use the data source in order to fill in the value for the service plan ID attribute on the service instance resource. And this is exactly what's happening here. So we have here a data source that fetches for the alert notification service in the plan standard the right technical service plan ID. And this one depends on the entitlement that entitles exactly this service offering. Now, to get a full overview what's already available, I have to point you to the documentation where we have listed and described all what gets changed when you activate this experimental parameter. If you want to try it out, feel free to do so, and we are happy to receive your feedback in the GitHub repository of the Terraform Exporter if you want to see more things getting done for you. And with that, happy terraforming.